Welcome to Education Perspectives. I am your host, Liza Holland. This is a podcast that explores the role of education in our society from a variety of lenses. Education needs to evolve to meet the needs of today and the future. Solving such huge issues requires understanding. Join me as we begin to explore the many perspectives of education. A leader in school-based social work programming, Kevin has more than 30 years of experience in working with children, families, and school staff. Kevin joined the Counseling in Schools, or CIS, in 1993 as a counselor and advanced to become a supervisor, trainer, and manager. Throughout his 31-year career at CIS, Kevin has led the process to evolve CIS's service reach beyond counseling services to include a multidimensional and strength-based menu of services that support an entire school community. As a result, he became the first executive director of counseling in schools, succeeding the founder, Cindy Juro, in 2012. In his current role, Kevin is committed to developing a team leadership model within the organization that embodies the non-oppressive, collaborative systems that are needed to effectively take on the complex challenges routinely faced in schools by children, families, teachers, and administrators. Kevin's outstanding work has been acknowledged through accolades, including the Commitment to Hope Award, Massachusetts Commonwealth Award, the West Side Chamber of Commerce Award, and Hunter College's Jacob Goldfiend Award. Prior to joining CIS, he worked as a Sojourner House Family Shelter in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Kevin is a licensed clinical social worker who earned his degree from the Hunter College School of Social Work. So, Kevin Dahill-Fuchel, welcome to Education Perspectives.
Great to be here.
Got to kick you off with our first question, which is the big one. From a 30,000-foot view, why do you think that we as a society need to invest in education?
Well, it's a great question, and certainly it is a 30,000-foot question, right? But from my point of view, I really think that schools, and particularly public schools, give us the opportunity to socialize our young people, to create a real connective point for the growth of our communities and our societies, our values, the way we treat one another, the way we understand the world, the outlook on life that we have. I mean, I think so much comes through those buildings and those experiences for us as people that they really are critical socialization mechanisms for our society.
They are indeed. They are indeed a wonderful way for kids to be able to start to learn how to live in society and whatnot. So you come at this from the perspective of social work. And I know you started early in a shelter, but have spent most of your time with CIS. What drew you to this kind of a role? What drew you to education?
I was really drawn to children and families, I think, early on, which is what brought me into the work at Sojourner House in Roxbury, Mass, which was in a shelter for homeless families. And I think I was really coming through my, undergrad education and really thinking about social justice and how society was working and who was kind of coming out where and when and how. And that was at a point in the 80s when families were beginning to sort of show up on the screen of being homeless. And that was something that was kind of shaking people up a little bit. I think we normally thought we had other words and other ways of thinking about those people who were unhoused, but we weren't thinking about children and families. And as I connected into that space and really started sort of, learning about the experiences that people were having, it really drew me to kind of want to keep trying to see how can I go kind of further upstream, if you will, to see where are some of the opportunities that younger people may have that could in some ways help mitigate or create barriers to ending up in that situation, understanding that so many of those situations have so many factors. But I do have a strong sense that when you have strong socialization, a strong social skill set, really well put together emotional makeup, and you have a capacity to sort of problem solve in the world and become a contributor to society, that probably you will have a better shot at living a life that you want, and not necessarily one that you are resigned to through circumstances that you feel you have no control over.
Absolutely. And it sounds to me like CIS really goes a long way in trying to fill that need and solve that problem. I noticed on the website talking about the nationwide average of counselors to students being an obnoxiously high number, somewhere in the 400s. So you and CIS help to kind of fill that gap. Tell us a little bit about what you do, how that works.
Yeah, I think filling the gap is a great way to put it. I mean, it's filling a gap not just in the sense of what schools need, and I'll speak to that in a minute, but definitely filling a gap in the communities we serve to the availability of quality mental health and behavioral health practitioners that really, families can access, children can access. All the services that we provide are no cost to a family or to a child. I mean, they're all grant supported, either private or public sources, and to really be able to implement in the context of a place where families and children come sort of quote unquote normally or for the general course of their life really means there are no other appointments being made. There aren't schedules being rearranged or people being dragged to appointments to go through doors that say, mental health, and folks don't necessarily want to come to that readily, right? So there's still stigma and things around that. So we really break down a lot of those barriers by implementing our services in a school. What the other gap around that is, and which you've identified from our website, in terms of that ratio of the title counselor to the individual, there is a skill set, a clinical skill set that we can bring into the space that really can start to move into the lives of children and families in the context, again, of their normal school day, in the context of their learning, where we're really experiencing with them how they are connecting to other people, how they are experiencing the adults in the world, their peers, what types of emotional responses are they having, what are they coming in with, how can we connect with the families and bring additional resources. So there's a lot of different tentacles into that child coming into the school that is really not possible. I mean, it really isn't. It's a gap that's not left because folks don't want to fill it. It's because there are other responsibilities that don't give them that opportunity. And there's a skill set that we have that we come in with that then gives us the ability to do the work that we do and really draw forward children and families into their own voice, into who they are, and really work on their strengths to build up the emotional capacity and their socialization skills.
I know here in Kentucky, we have kind of they call them Friskies, and it's a family and youth resource type of a center, but it's only available in certain schools, and it really does not necessarily serve all those wraparound needs for the community. Tell me about how you are making these different types of services available to the children and families, and how you feel that might have made a difference to let the students really be open to learning. I mean, because so many of these mental health and social and emotional well-being issues really help keep people, kids in particular, in that kind of fight or flight mode where it's really hard for them to learn.
It's hard for them to learn. And I think part of that learning is the social emotional learning as well as the academic learning, right? And I
Hmm.
think, I think a lot about this, and I appreciate your question because I do know that what we want to be able to measure most intently as someone matriculates through the various levels of schooling is that they've gained the knowledge that was in that level for them to achieve, right? So we want them to learn something they didn't know before. I also want to keep lifting up that we want them to, be as self-aware and as strong socially at each level. And I think both of those I really want them to be thought about as equal partners and not one as sort of only serving the other, because we certainly seen many examples of people who can amass a lot of knowledge, but really have a lot of difficulty relating to other people, or really then have a lot of difficulty managing the stress and stressors that are part and parcel of all of our lives, and certainly during times like COVID and all the rest. So I think that, all of that needs to come together at the same time. For us in New York City, I mean, New York City, we look a lot at particular communities where there are high levels of adverse childhood experiences. You may have heard of the ACEs study, right? That's the adverse childhood experiences. And that study also shows, to your point, that students who have scored high on that scale, right, a certain number of experiences, equate to a number, equate to a scale, that when you're high on that scale, that your ability to progress positively through the education system is really challenged. So we look at that within particular communities. We certainly, we served this past school year roughly 70 schools, and we'll probably be in roughly the same number this year, maybe a few more. The New York City public school system has about 1,700 schools. So we're a very small drop in the bucket. But even within the schools that we serve, the population that we serve, which is around 10,000 students throughout all of the schools that we serve, right? In some parts of the country, that's a whole school district. But here, we're doing our part within those areas where we can. One of the initiatives that I think you do have in Kentucky, we are working hard to maintain and grow here in New York, is the community school strategy, which is really that strategy of, just to your point before, how do you bring the community resources and connectivity into the school for that wraparound or that full whole child experience throughout their time from K to 12, and then certainly beyond that, but certainly in the K to 12 or pre-K to 12 time that they're there. So the community school initiative is a real big component of what we've been a part of here in New York City. There are 17 of those schools that we provide what's called the lead partner experience. Another 11 that we subcontracted to provide the behavioral health component too. But I would really encourage any of the listeners today to really look at that community school initiative, see where it is in your state, and what it is that you can do to kind of see it as that impactful strategy that schools can use to really advance what we're talking about today, the life of the child, the life of the family, into this productive, fulfilling experience.
Absolutely. It kind of gets me thinking about, you made a comment earlier about that balance between academics and social and emotional welfare. And that kind of gets me in that thought of how schools actually really need to change. And, we've got the content now in our pocket, right? So a lot of this stuff we can look up, but it's really the process and how kids are able to approach things and be able to communicate effectively, all those durable skills that business and industry are asking for. And it seems like that's a really good marriage there. What are your thoughts on that?
100% agree. And I think that, amongst one of the other comments I made that probably I didn't emphasize enough was just this idea of how do you get students' own voice into their education, and how do you bring sort of families and their experience into the educational experience so that they are, engaged and in part of what is happening. Because part of what the training is in that can work, that schools can work against, is if you really just have a conformist type educational experience where you're learning to do what you're told, or you're learning to follow instruction, but are you learning to follow, what you feel inside, or you're learning to follow what you believe? You have to be taught, you have to follow some part of the way to sort of get knowledge so that you have, not just coming off from your own first reactions. There needs to be an educated component to what you express. But having that opportunity and really seeing that that's part of the goal of the educational process. And that does it certainly includes the social and emotional element to it, right? How well, how to sort of, to sort of tick my age here a little bit, to do a little winning friends and influencing people. I'm going back to, the books of yore that taught those things. But those are real skills. Like, how do you engage another person to have a persuasive, argument, if that's what it is that you need to do, or to share an experience that you think it's important for them to know about. And our schools giving our young people that opportunity, or they're being asked to just sort of parrot back other experiences that other people have had that are intended to give them the idea of what they can do in their life, but never really give them the training ground to kind of put forward what it is that they might be thinking about doing in their own life. So I think that, I'm right on board with where you are in terms of that marriage and what it can do.
I just feel like teachers need to take a little more of a coach role rather than a sage on the stage, as it were, because kids, what our system right now is not doing well in most places is inspiring them to be lifelong learners. And with the pace of change that we have going on today, that's what we need to instill. And to me, I think that student agency piece is a real key. Do you find that with the students that you're working with, that if you can, empower their self-confidence and whatnot, that they might control their own learning a bit more?
Absolutely, and I think one of the ways that happens for any adult in the school building, certainly teachers, but any of the adults whose children interact with, I think, have an influence on this part of what we're talking about. And I think that that is to sort of develop a relationship with a student, and that involves not an entirely breakdown of boundaries, but some personal sharing of your experience. And certainly, if you're passionate, we want our teachers to be passionate about most people get into teaching and they are passionate about a particular subject matter, about what, the future that they want to see for children. They come in with ideas and passions. And sometimes because of the constrictions that the curricula or some of the other outcomes that people are expecting, it gets really tampered down. So that adult doesn't isn't exuding that. Like, the students aren't picking that up from the teacher, even though if you were able to peel the other stuff back, that teacher might be someone who you're like, wow, I want to be like that person when I, grow up, because they can share it with you and you can feel it from them, and then they give that to you and you take the floor and you can bring that forward. So I think those relationship building skills are an element that we focus on when we do work in schools. And I go back to the community school initiative. One of the things we look at is, what's the culture of the whole school? What's the environment that people are experiencing when they're in that building? And sometimes it comes down to us then, creating these modules with teachers and other school staff just around some basic relationship building skills with young people. And how do you decode, what might seem like, well, that's someone's being disrespectful, or that young person is, not really taking this seriously, or this and that. And how do you understand, particularly if I go back to the idea of, we're working in schools with children that have lots of adverse childhood experiences. And I don't think New York City is the only place that happens.
Nope.
It happens lots of places. And those things that students act out in front of the adults often are interpreted in ways that are in the language of the adult and their experience, but not in the language that the student is communicating. And how do you translate that so that you can connect? Because in many ways, those behaviors that would come to mind probably if someone's hearing this are actually attempts to reach out. They're not, they may appear to be pushing you away, but that arm extended is an arm extended. It's actually a hand open. And how do you make that connection? And once you do, then you can let the child in a little bit into you. And then from there to the subject matter, and make those bridges always back to your subject matter, but using yourself as that vehicle for the relationship, and for that relationship to be the vehicle to the subject matter. That's not like it's 1, 2, 3, you learned it and you're done. It's an ongoing practice, right? Like, I learned as a social worker that I have a practice. That means that I'm always have to be learning. I think teachers have a practice, a pedagogical practice that is constantly needing to be kind of looked at and understood, not necessarily always with just the newest technique, learn to use the smart board, learn to use the internet, but with those relationship skills. And what is the experience in the community around you? Who are those children who are coming into your classroom, and what do they need from you as a human being, so that they can learn as a student and, like, as you say, become that lifelong learner?
There are so many different things that both our students, our families, our educators, everybody have to deal with. And it was a little bit of a dysfunctional system before COVID hit, but COVID was kind of like a bomb. And now we're seeing constantly in the media about the levels of anxiety that students are facing. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you guys are doing to kind of meet that need?
Yeah, I mean, I think that description, I just got a little chill when you say COVID as a bomb, because I think that it really did kind of explode onto the scene and did seem to drop out of the sky in some way. One of the ways I think about what happened during COVID was that for a while, and I think it's actually still true, but it's receded into the background a bit. But I think it's really, there's typically been a gap between the experience of trauma that the adults in the building have had and that the children have had coming in. And I think COVID shrunk that gap, where all of a sudden the fear and the trauma that everyone was experiencing, certainly in New York City. We didn't leave our home for 4 months, right? There were, trucks outside the morgues. Like, no one was going, you were scared. if you were human and you were alive, you were scared. And then that meant everybody, teacher, child, young, old. It was a very fraught and fearful time. And I think that coming out of that, there are still, these strands of that same anxiety. I do think, again, we've tried to address it from the point of view of going to first to the adults in the school building and back to that school climate question. Like, where are the support systems in place for teachers? And we do this for our own staff within the organization, right? It's not, a lot of people talk about, well, you have to have self-care, self-care, self-care. Well, that also puts a lot of pressure on the individual. What's being made available within your institution that you run for people to be cared for? How do you create careful experiences of care and wellness? A lot of the schools now that we have, and we have what we set up as these sort of wellness rooms. It's certainly something that's talked about, and I think is probably done in a lot of different cities and states. But in New York City, there used to be these rooms when students were, having a bad day, and they called them save rooms instead of suspending. So right? They kind of look like, someone got the bad assignment to have to stand there and sit in the room over the kids who would otherwise have been sent home, but you don't send kids home anymore. So like this kind of thing, those got flipped around, and we really did a lot of work with a number of our schools to turn those into like wellness experiences for people that they then would go to proactively ahead of an experience where, like, I feel like I'm losing it, I got to take a break. And there's procedures for how, you can't just walk in between classes and goof off. There was a way to establish the protocols around really moving into that kind of space. And once you set those protocols, and we set those protocols in motion, they got really taken seriously. One of the things that I've learned over, all of the years that I've worked with counseling in school is that when you create a clear structure and standards for young people, they will adhere to them and they will rise to them. If you are not clear, and if your standards are based on the lowest common denominator, they will be murky and they will reach for the lowest common denominator. And when you set it high, they go high and they even go higher. And it takes some stamina to sort of hold until that takes hold, but it really, really works. And it's really powerful. So I think, again, back to your question around how do we respond to what happened in COVID, we really start with wellness for ourselves, wellness for the adults, so they can then again be available for the young people. Because I think what we saw coming right out of COVID, suspension started going up, things started getting really, attendance was way down, children not wanting to come to school, parents afraid to send their kids to school still, all kinds of different dynamics that were based on, the fear that was there. And I think the fear was what was in the adults, because we weren't confident that we knew what to do, and we weren't feeling good about ourselves, afraid about our parents. If you lived in a multi-generational home where you had a mother and a father in a nursing home, all these things that were on our minds meant that we had very little left to give to the young people coming to school, who then had that much more that they needed. So it really was the idea of how do we rebuild and reform that capacity by taking care of the adults in the school community so that they can be available for the children. And that has had a very positive effect as we've developed now, 4 years essentially out from the pandemic.
I love what you talked about for the students and kind of making it more of a proactive and maybe an opportunity to talk about how you regulate and process your emotions, kind of building their toolkit. They call them safe rooms here in Kentucky, and it almost got to be a joke because it really turned out to be like in-school detention as opposed to something productive. And I think that was the original intent and why they named it that way. But I really love that whole concept, because if kids have too much else on their mind and they're not open to learning, they should be able to go to a place where they can get help to be able to get to a better place for that.
And part of that, Liza, I'm sorry, just to interrupt, but part of that was actually changing the physical structure of those rooms.
Okay, tell us about it.
Yeah, actually investing in, carpets, in taking out the fluorescent lighting and putting in some other lighting, putting up different kinds of images on the walls, having soft furniture in the room, not the hard desk that would normally be there. Having one of our places they use these things, I want to say, like, that create different aromas, right? Like kind of an oil thing or something like that, infusion, sensory go around. I mean, there's an organization called Sensory Elsewhere, which actually does this in hospitals for surgeons to kind of have a different room to go to in order to decompress from all the stress that they go through. So we took some lessons from that, but in some of just, the physical landscapes that you can kind of project onto a wall, different things that just really make it a very different space. It's not just the words that someone might greet you with. Those are certainly important and they create a context, but the physical experience being unique and different and really based on things that are centering and calming for students, and it really works.
Are you doing the same types of things for teachers? Like in the teachers' break rooms and that sort of thing?
Absolutely.
What
Yep.
kinds of things? I think a lot of times principals are like, well, I'd really like to do something, but I have no idea what I would do. Do you have any examples of some neat things that teachers have particularly appreciated?
They've been, like I said, there's been some simple things like changing the lighting. There's been some things like a few places we put in a few aquariums so that there's just like, this calming little fish thing going on there, right? People can look at that and you kind of get moved away. We haven't done this, but I know in New York, there are a couple of programs that actually have, and you may have had this in Kentucky, where they have groups that bring in puppies for students that are dysregulated and they can kind of play with a puppy for a little bit. Younger kids, they do that with. Again, that's not our piece, but that's been effective in other places. But in teacher rooms, there'll be signs in some of the rooms where it's like they ask people to leave their phones out, not to bring their phones in, for the teachers, to have it just be a quiet space where anybody in there is just kind of meditating or what have you. In some places that works. I think that when you make you make a statement when you set up a room like that and you invest in it and you ask people what will help you feel calming and grounded in a space. And we did some of that, and you put a few of those things in there. And again, as an administrator or a principal in the school, when you do that, teachers really appreciate that because they know that, there are all kinds of other agendas that they have to adhere to, that the principal has to adhere to. But when they make that one of their priorities for you, it really, it means a lot. It means a lot to the teachers. And I know in our organization, we do it with our staff as well. And it means a lot to them.
That's marvelous. So I love that you guys are an outside agency partnering really well with the schools, but that can also kind of create some difficulties in and of itself. What have been the challenges that you've faced in trying to be able to integrate into the schools and, kind of become a part of how school is being done?
I think the two critical components. One is certainly the principal of any school is a key player in that. And if they really understand what we're there to do and are willing to be open to engaging with us, we don't come in saying we're the experts. Here's what you have to do. I'm not going to give you a blueprint. Now do 1, 2, 3. You'll be done. But I am going to say, I want to be at the table with you when you're making some bigger decision. I want to sort of hear what your plan is for your school, what your vision is, and I want to talk to you about when I have observations of things that I think maybe are challenging the vision that you have or not realizing what. And I want you to be open to having that conversation with me. And when a principal is, and we can start to make some inroads on that, that's a great indicator, a great sign. I think the other area, which is going to be of no surprise. I mean, as an outside agency, of course, right? I see you already anticipating I'm going to say it's the funding, right? Able to be a consistent presence. So we want to make sure that when we're creating that partnership, that we are building in some sustainability practices, that there are some other people that are getting the understanding of how it is that we're seeing things and what it is that we're doing, knowing that if the funding does go away for whatever reason, the skill set that we have to interact with our clinical ability isn't necessarily going to be shared, but some of the systemic ways in which we thought about or implemented programming and practices like the safe room we were just talking about or other things, those are things that, right, they can be evergreen and not necessarily only tied to when it is that we're there. So, we typically, are able to maintain our relationships over a long period of time, but unfortunately, when those relationships shift, it's not usually because everyone's thought, well, that problem is solved. It's usually because everyone was like, well, we have to shift where we put the funds this year.
And that is so real. There are so many different challenges that schools face. They're faced with that. Well, we may have to give up one thing in order to do another. And there's a lot of making do, which is really unfortunate. So that kind of leads into my last question, which is, tell me from your perspective, what would you like decision makers to know? And you can define decision makers however you would like to.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, I think some of what I said, I think I like decision makers to appreciate the role that schools have, both in socializing and in developing healthy emotional experiences for children and for adults, and also the role that schools have as what we call counseling in schools centers of healing. That people generation after generation is going to come to those buildings, building in practices, building in elements of the culture of those buildings that educate, that socialize, that heal, that build emotional wellness, just is an important thing to do, so that when you're creating policies or creating structures, if those are part and parcel of what you're doing, along with all of the resources that you need for people to leave with information they didn't have when they got there, so that they can be better problem solvers and know more and appreciate more, have a bigger view of the world because they've read the good books, or they understand how numbers work, or they understand how the sun revolves around the cosmos, or whatever we need to learn that you want them to learn. All that's super important too. And I think we spent most of our experience figuring out the best ways to do that. I'd like us to spend more time understanding, how do we make the social emotional parts of the school system work. I mean, one of the things people who talk to me about this have heard me say a bunch, so your listeners will get to hear me say now, you take 300 people, adults, kids across generations, put them in a building for 8 hours a day for 183 days a year. Two things are definitely going to happen. A social order is going to emerge. People's emotions are going to be impacted by that experience. The thing that maybe is going to happen is that they'll leave with more information about some knowledge that they had that they didn't have. So why don't we concentrate a little bit more on the two things that we know are going to happen, and let them be intentional about how we socialize and about how we create emotional experiences, and then also continue to pay attention to how we make sure the information they get is important information that they can go into life with, well suited to be productive citizens.
Well, that is a great end to a really good conversation. Thank you so much, Kevin, for being a guest with us here today.
Thank you, Liza. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Education Perspectives. Feel free to share your thoughts on our Facebook page. Let us know which education perspectives you would like to hear or share. Please subscribe and share with your friends.